Good morning. I'm Janet Woodcock. I'm Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA, and I'd like to tell you about some of the important initiatives and changes that I see going on in drug development and drug regulation, and then I'll talk a little bit about how Translationality, that you're going to hear about, fits into this. This is really an exciting time for drug developers, for patients, and for health professionals, because I think we're seeing a wave of innovation and new therapies coming into clinical development and even onto the market that really have tremendous potential to benefit people. And in infectious disease, in cancer, and a number of other areas, there's new hope for patients. But we have a lot of problems in the drug development world, and recently initiatives have been launched by the FDA, by others, by Translationality, for example, to try and address some of these roadblocks to translating innovation into safe and effective therapies for patients. The problems, I think, can be grouped in a number of different ways, but first of all, let's start with science. Science, of course, is the engine that drives innovation, and the biomedical research puts forth discoveries that then have to be translated. The problem is that the translational infrastructure really isn't up to the task right now. And so we have very, very expensive and prolonged drug development programs, and people are concerned about that barrier and the cost of drug development when we're talking about exciting innovations in the laboratory. How are we going to get over that barrier and get them into the clinic? And of course, some people say, well, we should just relax the standards, but that's not the right answer. The public, health professionals, even the payers expect good evidence about how drugs are performing, how they will work in patients, what benefits they provide, and what their potential liabilities might be. So we can't give up generating that evidence. We need to generate that evidence in a more efficient and effective manner that also provides more information. So what's happening there? Well, as many of you know, in the early 2000s, FDA launched an initiative called the Critical Path Initiative, where we performed an analysis of the various problems that occur in translational science and the barriers to getting innovations on the market. And in the scientific world, a lot of those problems relate to the ability to understand the underlying causes of disease and to understand the natural history and pathophysiology of diseases. So as a response to that, many different initiatives have been launched. For example, one good way to develop drugs and understand their actions in people is to have good biomarkers that measure the course of disease and then the impact of therapy on the disease. So we identified that as part of the Critical Path Initiative, and numerous consortia have been set up to study various biomarkers and to provide better evidence. One of the principal ones, of course, is at the Foundation for NIH, called the Biomarkers Consortium, and that involves numerous pharmaceutical companies, patient groups, professional groups, NIH, FDA, and other stakeholders that come together to do projects to advance various biomarkers such as imaging, laboratory tests, and so forth, so that we can better understand what's happening in people when we try to test these innovations. These biomarkers are both on the safety side. The most prominent there is drug-induced kidney illness or injury, and on the efficacy side, for example, using FDG PET as an endpoint for lymphomas. So the Biomarker Consortium is taking on a wide range of biomarker development and qualification initiatives. Similarly, the CPATH Institute in Arizona, which many of you may know about, in the US, is started out back with the Critical Path Initiative, and they also are doing multiple projects on biomarker development, particularly in drug safety, which is really important for us to have better ways to predict drug safety problems before the drugs are out in many people. And so they're to be, I think, commended for a very robust program. They're doing other things that I will talk about later, but these biomarkers, I think, are extremely important. Now, on FDA's side, we set up a biomarker qualification process. And what does that mean? Well, it turns out that there's no formal way that the community, the biomedical community, accepts a biomarker as valid. It's just sort of people publish them, and then people argue with the regulatory agencies about whether they should be used or not. So we thought, well, it's not really FDA's mission, but we need to have a formal process whereby evidence is developed and then accepted by the regulatory agencies so that everybody can know what the status of any given biomarker might be. And we are running these processes. We have accepted biomarkers. We worked with Europe, the EMA, and they have their own process for acceptance as well. And we also work with the Japanese regulator, so they are watching this activity. So a lot has gone on with biomarkers. There's still problems with determining what the framework might be for qualification. What is the evidence base that would lead you to accept a biomarker, say, for enrichment in a trial, or as an endpoint, surrogate endpoint, for example, in a development program? That isn't well worked out, and we need as a society to have much more conversation about that. We really need to have a process to get that done. Now, in Europe, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, IMI, has been going on for about 5 years, and that initiative also is looking at biomarkers as one of its activities. And so there's a lot of activity going on around the globe in trying to qualify biomarkers. Now, another problem with the science is that we do not understand very well the natural history of many diseases. I mean, that seems amazing since people have had these diseases forever. But for a long time, of course, for example, genetic diseases and so forth, we didn't know what caused them. We didn't understand them very well. And in fact, the funding wasn't available often to do a very careful look at what happens to people over time who have various diseases. As you know, like the Framingham study, which is a very long longitudinal study, has yielded a treasure trove of information about diseases that happen to ordinary Americans and help us figure out how to design trials better to treat those diseases. But we don't have a Framingham study for most diseases. So we have been working at FDA with other parties to develop natural history registries, studies, and other things. And the National Organization for Rare Diseases has set up a program, a computer program that patient groups can use to follow the natural history of rare diseases. And this is very important because that kind of information is really lacking on very rare diseases because there just haven't been enough people to know. And of course, as you all know, as regulatory professionals, to power trials and determine the feasibility of a development program, you have to have a pretty good idea of what happens to the people you're intending to treat before you go and launch a whole program. So that is good that that's going on. Now, another whole set of problems is the clinical trial enterprise. And many people have talked about this, and it's one of the focuses, I think, of the Translationality project. Right now, as you well know, a clinical trial, people think of it, they have a specific drug in mind, they gather together investigators, they get thought leaders, they try to find out what happens to people with the disease and the stage of disease. Then they have a long protocol writing activity, and then they have to get sites, and they have to sign up the sites, and they have to make agreements with the sites and sign contracts, and then they have to get IRB approval, and then sometime way down the line, they may be able to launch the trial, and yet they may not get accrual, sites may languish, the trial may not be completed, and there's a lot of time and money sunk in these type of activities. And then when the trial is over, everything is dismantled, and later start over again. This is a very inefficient way of trying to generate evidence about medical interventions, and we can do better than this. So Translational is one example where the pharmaceutical industry itself got together and is trying to change and improve targeted parts of the clinical drug development process. And you'll hear about that in more detail. Other activities that are going on include trying to develop master protocols or standing trial networks, both of which sort of flip the paradigm on its head. And instead of using, designing a single trial for a new drug that's in development, you have a standing network that's capable of evaluating many drugs. And most recently, the Friends of Cancer Research, the Foundation for NIH, and NCI, working with a lot of pharmaceutical companies and FDA, set up a master protocol for advanced squamous cell lung cancer. And currently they're testing 5 different investigational agents in that trial. But the point is that the trial has the capacity to incorporate new investigational agents and keep on going. And that is a design that's very desirable, that we keep evaluating this stage of lung cancer, which is usually incurable, until we have major results, until we make a major improvement in that disease, and we get better and better therapies that we can continue to test, perhaps in combination, until we start seeing cures of this stage of lung cancer. So that's an important area, which is the reform of how clinical trials are done. A whole nother area we're working on is looking at endpoints. What are you trying to achieve when you do a trial or a drug development program? And of course, we have the payers playing much more now on whether or not drugs should be used and how much value they add. And so there's a lot more emphasis on value added in drug development and assessing that. And that's where the patient comes in front and center. Really, you want to improve how people feel, function, or survive, right? And to do that, especially the feel or function part, you have to know what is bothering them about the disease. And you have to know the negative impacts of the disease, what the most serious symptoms are from the patient's point of view. And you also have to know how they feel about existing therapies, if any are available. How beneficial are they? What are their downsides? And so as part of the PDUFA negotiation last time, most recent one, FDA and industry put forth the concept of patient-centered drug development, and that we would have a series of 20 meetings over a 5-year period with different patient groups, different disease groups, to learn from the patients themselves what is the burden of disease and how are the therapies currently working and what symptoms would they like to see addressed in their disease. Our first workshop was on chronic fatigue syndrome, which currently has no approved therapies. And we heard some very heart-rending stories about the devastating effect this condition has on people's lives and what they would need to have it improved. And subsequent to that, FDA issued a draft guidance on chronic fatigue syndrome, which we hope would drive development in this area by laying out endpoints that could be used in trials for chronic fatigue syndrome. Since that time, we've had multiple additional meetings, and we intend to keep running through this. Closely linked to this activity is the idea of patient-reported outcomes. Those haven't been used that much in clinical development programs, except for symptomatic diseases where you have pain, for example. The endpoint is relief of pain, and that is a patient-driven outcome. But for many diseases, say cancer chemotherapy, we haven't recorded very well those effects on the patient, some of which can be devastating. So now we have many groups, including the CPATH Institute and many other groups, working on developing patient-reported outcome measures that could be used in trials and then put in labels as claims, so that we really incorporate the viewpoint of the patient. And this process is ongoing, and FDA has set up a similar qualification program for patient-reported outcomes, where people can submit to us and we will eventually render a qualification decision publicly so that people could use this outcome measure in disease trials. There's been great enthusiasm by patient groups and professional groups in participating in this process, and it's robustly subscribed. So that's very important. Now, that raises the question then about how to incorporate all this information into a regulatory assessment. We've been piloting at CDER for the past 4 years, I think, a structured benefit risk assessment. This is intended to be completed by the medical folks clinical people who do the evaluation of the drug, and is in a formal structure that would be in the front of the review. It should incorporate the patient's point of view in the beginning of it, talking about the burden of disease. Because unless you have a good idea of the patient burden of disease, it's hard to quantify or even qualitatively assess the benefits of the drug. So we are currently piloting that. We're going through a cycle of implementing it in reviews. We will assess that, and then we'll have more public discussion about how to do benefit risk assessments in a regulatory setting. This is very important because, of course, the payers want to know for their customers, the patients, they really want to know, do these new interventions add value, and what kind of value do they add? And they're very interested in the patient point of view. So I think this is a synergy across various sectors that we really want to know from the patient. Has this drug benefited you? What are its liabilities? What are its downsides? And this will help doctors and other prescribers in counseling patients about whether they should consider to take a drug or not. So I think all of these activities together will begin to help streamline the drug development process. Particularly as far as savings go, would be the use of trial networks, master protocols, and other things that actually streamline the actual setting up of the clinical trials in that process, which usually can take many years. We have many other activities going on at FDA CDER that are aimed at improving our understanding of drug development, our ability to assess drugs. One of the very interesting programs that was put in place with the Food and Drug Safety and Innovation Act, or FDASIA, is the Breakthrough Therapy Designation Program. This program was born out of the observation that a number of new drugs are really game changers for serious diseases, so that perhaps before no treatment was available for this disease or stage of disease, and along comes a treatment that doesn't just have a tiny bit of benefit, but actually has a major impact on the disease. And so the designation program was put into the statute, and we have begun implementing that, and it's been wildly popular to our surprise. We've designated, I think, around 50 breakthrough drugs in different stages of development. This is a developmental designation, although people are permitted to apply up to the time of approval for designation, but it really provides the most benefit, we think, in drug development, where once a designation occurs, then we work with the sponsor very closely to try and streamline that development program because of the promise it shows. So it's only for serious and life-threatening diseases. And the sponsor has to come in with clinical data, not laboratory promise, which you know pertains to a large number of compounds, but actual clinical data that suggest the drug may be a game changer in one of these terrible diseases. So that's good news that we have so many of these under development. Of course, not all of them will prove to be what was hoped. And that, of course, is a downside for patients because it may raise their hope, and then further evaluation shows the drug wasn't as good as we thought. But we've approved a number of these already based on really significant patient benefits. this program is causing a lot of effort on our part, but I think as physicians, this is something that we really care about, is to get drugs that really make a difference to people who are very ill. So there are many other activities going on at CEDAR. We also have a huge generic drug program, the user fee program that we're implementing. We're in the third year of that program. We're beginning the third year October 1. That's a huge push for the center. And we plan to deliver on our commitments under the GDUFA program. We also are doing a new effort on regulating pharmacy compounding. That's taking a great deal of resources and effort to try and put together a scheme for how pharmacy compounding would be regulated. It includes a new category of industry called outsourcing that will be subject to GMPs, but will not require applications. And we'll have to see how this all plays out over the next couple years. We also are doing a huge quality initiative where we're planning to change how we regulate the quality of pharmaceuticals. And this, we hope, will play out over the next 6 months, and we'll get a new organization stood up, and we already have changed many of our approaches to pharmaceutical quality, and we think this, we hope, will bring the regulation of pharmaceutical quality well into the 21st century and really finish the efforts we began in the early 2000s in this area. So in sum, as usual, there are many exciting activities going on in CEDAR. There's a tremendous amount of excitement and effort in multiple different areas. The drug development process that Translational is focused on, for example, has a lot of attention and effort, and I think many of the initiatives we have begun are beginning to pay off, as well as Translational efforts and by the other consortia to streamline this drug development process. So it's always exciting and very challenging to stay ahead of the science and the social changes and the whole milieu in which drug development operates. But I think because the science has moved ahead so far, we're going to see a really exciting new era of drug development. And as regulatory professionals, I think we all need to be ready for that. Thank you.